Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack. Today's episode comes about. Today's episode comes about because I've been talking with several clients over the past month or so about dishonesty, why we lie, and how we learn to tell the truth. Many of you may have heard the joke, how do you know if an addict is lying? Because their lips are moving. And that joke, like a lot of jokes, has never sat well with me because not only is it disrespectful, I also think it minimizes what's actually happening underneath dishonesty. I also don't think that addicts are the only people who lie. In thinking about this episode, I decided I didn't want to share my clients' personal stories because they're personal and it didn't feel right. Even if I anonymized the details, it didn't feel right. So I'm going to be pulling examples for what I'm talking about today from my own personal life. I've often said to clients, speaking of myself, I came by my dishonesty honestly. And usually that gets a reaction because it sounds like I'm justifying dishonesty, but I'm not. What I'm trying to do is understand it. First, I had to understand it in myself and then in the clients that I work with. Like many of you, I grew up hearing how important honesty was. It was taught at church. It was talked about at home. There were sayings on the wall about honesty and about being truthful. And it tied it to being a good person. And the messages that I received, maybe like you received, there's not a lot of wiggle room in those messages. Honesty was what good people did. And at the very same time, I was growing up in a system where dishonesty was, in some ways, in a lot of ways, more functional. There was a version of our family that we presented to the outside world. It's what the neighbors saw or knew. It's what people at church saw. But it didn't match the full reality. So I was being taught to value honesty while also learning how to survive by not fully telling the truth. And those two things didn't match. Most of us are taught to think about dishonesty as a character issue, a character flaw, like you either value truth or you don't. But what if that's not where the story starts? What if, for many of us, dishonesty wasn't something we chose, but something we learned? Not because we were bad, but because it helped us survive. In my family, nobody sat me down and said, in our family, we have to be dishonest, and here's how to do it. But I did learn something very clearly. There are things we say, and there are things we don't say. There are things we see, and there are things we're not supposed to fully see. And as a kid, I remember trying to make sense of that. I would ask questions. I was trying to make sense and connect the dots. I remember one time asking my mom why my dad worked such long hours, especially because we didn't seem to have money. Those questions usually didn't go well. Either I would get shut down or I'd get what I now think of as a useless platitude. Something like, Jackie, your dad works hard. Well, that wasn't my question. And as a kid, I knew that didn't actually answer my question. It didn't help me understand what I was seeing. It didn't help me make sense of what I was feeling. So over time, you stop asking questions, not because you don't want to understand, but because you learn that understanding isn't available. And when those questions didn't go well, when I got shut down or given answers that really didn't answer anything, I didn't stop being curious. I just had to find other ways to try to understand. I would sit out of sight and listen to conversations. I would read my mom's journal. I was trying to figure out what was actually true, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was feeling, and why they didn't match what was being said. Maybe you could argue, I'm not going to disagree, that I was being sneaky or intrusive. But I also think it was me trying to orient myself in an environment where the truth wasn't directly available. Another thing I did as a kid and teenager was I kept a journal. I just assumed that my mom was reading my journal. So I wouldn't write what actually happened. I developed my own kind of code. I used certain words or phrases that meant something to me, but wouldn't really make sense to someone else if they read it. It was my way of protecting my inner world. Looking back, I don't know that that is about being deceptive in the way we usually think of lying. It was a survival strategy. I often was trying to hold on to something true while also protecting myself from what might happen if that truth was seen. And I think this example shows that secrecy doesn't always look like what we think it does from the outside. It isn't always about manipulation. I think it's another way dishonesty can take shape. Not as lying to manipulate, but as learning to filter, to code, or to hide parts of my truth, or hide parts of your truth, because it doesn't feel safe for it to be fully seen. Sometimes it's about self-protection in an environment where truth didn't feel safe. The only truth that I had access to was my truth, which was still confusing. It wasn't clear, but I knew I had to find a way to keep it safe. So I think dishonesty sometimes is about self-protection in an environment where truth doesn't feel safe. I remember when I first learned the term dysfunctional family in my undergraduate social work program. And sitting in class and hearing about that, I felt relief, even some excitement. Because if it had a name, I could finally make sense of it. It was the first time I had language for something I had felt for a long time, but I couldn't name. So I did what I think a lot of us do when we finally understand something. I went home and told my mom. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought that she might feel the same way I did. Like, oh, this has a name. This explains something. She did not. We had a huge fight. And I found myself in this position, not for the first time, where I had to convince her that I didn't actually believe our family was dysfunctional because she was not going to accept that. And she wasn't easy to convince. My mom was smart. So convincing her that what I said, I didn't really believe or think took time. We would argue for hours. I think she felt that after several hours had passed, she had worn me down enough that I was giving her the truth. But at the same time, I was holding on to my own truth that we were a dysfunctional family. So I was doing what I had learned to do over and over, maintaining the relationship and holding a reality that couldn't be spoken out loud. And I think this is such an important dynamic to understand when it is or was present, because it teaches you something very specific. It teaches you that truth can cost you connection. It can cost you attachment. It costs you safety, and it can even threaten survival. And when you learn that early enough, your system just starts to organize around it. What do I say? What do I not say? What can be true and still keep me connected? I see this a lot with clients. They're not just struggling with honesty, they're struggling with what honesty might cost them. Because for many people, honesty isn't just about telling the truth. It's about risking connection, losing attachment. It's about survival. And it's about learning to hold on to some version, any version of love that is available. There's something I came across a few months ago. I don't remember exactly where, so I can't cite the source. I may have heard it on a podcast or in a book. I might have read it. I don't really recall, but it did stick with me. And the idea was this: there's no such thing as conditional love. There's only unconditional love and conditional approval. And I think that's such an important distinction because a lot of us grow up thinking, I'm loved as long as I'm doing the right thing, or I'm loved as long as I don't disrupt anything, or I'm loved as long as I don't say something that creates tension. But that's not actually unconditional love. That's conditional approval. And the thing about conditional approval is you're never done. You might get it once, but then there's the next thing and the next expectation and the next way that you have to adjust yourself to keep getting conditional approval. So when I think about moments like telling my mom what I was learning in school, what I was really running into wasn't a loss of love. It was a loss of approval. When I asked her questions she wasn't comfortable with, there was dismissal and loss of approval. I wasn't just learning how to not tell the truth out loud. I was learning how to contain it internally. And when you grow up like that, where truth isn't fully safe, even inside your own space, it makes sense that honesty later in life becomes complicated. When you've lived long enough in that system, honesty doesn't just feel hard, it feels risky. And one more thing, a lot of this learning happens very early. And here's something that I understand now that I didn't understand then. As a child, you are completely dependent on the people raising you. So if on some level you start to realize these people might not actually be dependable, that's not just disappointing, that is threatening. And it happens really young. Because at that age, we're not thinking about this logically. It may not even be a thought that crosses through our mind because it's not happening at a thinking level. It's more of a sense. We have a sense of not being safe. It's happening at a core level and at a nervous system level. Because at a nervous system level or at a core level, your system isn't asking, are they doing a good job parenting? Your system is asking, am I okay if they're not? And for most kids, that's way too much to hold. It's even threatening to our psyche. So instead of landing on something isn't right here, we tend to land somewhere else. We make meaning about ourselves. Something like, maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I'm too much. Maybe something is wrong with me. Because that's actually easier to hold as a child. It keeps the world predictable. It keeps the attachment intact. If the problem is me, then the people I depend on can stay okay. So the responsibility gets internalized. The onus goes onto us instead of onto them. And that keeps things stable. We adapt to what the environment requires of us. As we get older, we don't just stay in that same place. We start to adapt in different ways. We may soften the truth. We minimize it. We normalize it. Sometimes we stop seeing it altogether. And for many of the clients I work with, they don't know the truth anymore, but they believe the responsibility that they internalized. Or we can go the other direction and we rebel against it. But the important thing to realize is all of those responses still keep the focus on us. They all keep the onus on us. And what all of this does is it kicks the can down the road. It keeps us safe and stable and adapting in the present. But the wording I use is it creates a clusterfuck down the road because nothing actually is getting resolved. We've adapted, we've coped, we've figured out ways to function. But the original meaning that we made, I'm not enough, I'm too much, something's wrong with me, that's still sitting there. Those beliefs have stayed in the system. They just go underground. But they show up in our adult relationships. They show up in how we handle conflict. It shows up in whether we can tell the truth or not. It also shows up in ways that makes us think, I don't even want to be known. Because if at a core level, you're carrying the belief that something is wrong with you, then being fully honest or being fully seen doesn't feel neutral. It feels risky. It feels scary. It feels like we will be rejected. Eventually, at some point in adulthood, we have to start unraveling all of this. And I think this is one of the earliest places dishonesty begins. Not as lying to other people, but as learning not to fully see, not to fully question, not to trust, and not to fully say what doesn't make sense or advocate for yourself. That kind of learning happens really early. We're not talking about something that you figured out as an adult or something that started in your adult relationships. We're talking about something your system learned when you were very young. Often before you had language, before you had context, and before you had the ability to step back and say, wait, this doesn't make sense. So this doesn't just live in your thinking, it gets wired into your nervous system because you didn't learn it with your thinking brain. You learned it in your body. And that's why later in life, it can feel automatic. Like you're already avoiding telling the truth or softening it or shutting down before you even have time to think about it. And I see this all the time in my work with addiction and betrayal trauma. Clients may come in, they've relapsed, they didn't tell their spouse. When their spouse had a sense that they might have relapsed and asked about it, they weren't honest. And they come in and they'll say, I don't know why I lied. And often their partner is saying, why couldn't you just tell me the truth? Both of those questions make sense. But I also think they're missing something deeper. In those moments, it's not just a decision. Sometimes it's not even a decision at all. It doesn't pass through the prefrontal cortex. For a lot of clients that I work with, the thought of lying never passes through their thinking brain. It doesn't go through a process of, should I tell the truth or should I not tell the truth? It starts in their body. It might be a feeling of heat that starts in the core or in their gut and moves up to their face. They'll describe feeling flushed or a tightening in their body or in their chest, a sense of pressure or urgency, which is a nervous system response. And what we understand as decision making may not even be part of it in that initial moment. When shame gets activated, and for a lot of people, it gets activated very quickly. Telling the truth doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it can feel threatening. Like, if I say this, something bad is going to happen. If I'm fully seen, I'm not going to be okay. If you know this about me, I could lose you. So the brain shifts not to what's the honest thing to do, but how do I get out of this without feeling this way? Not into thinking, but into protecting. And many clients will just describe feeling those sensations in their body, and then the lie just comes out. Not as calculated manipulation, but as a way to reduce immediate overwhelm. And then often, right after the lie, comes shutdown, that freeze response. So if you're observing this, what you might see is activation, overwhelm, moving into survival, and then a collapse. And when we understand that, it doesn't excuse the behavior, but it changes how we work with it. Because just telling someone, be honest, isn't enough. And I want to speak for a moment to partners. Because if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, I hear all of this. I'm open to this, but I'm still the one being lied to, and that doesn't feel good. And I want to acknowledge that's true. And that asking for honesty in a relationship is not unreasonable. If you've been on the receiving end of dishonesty, especially repeated dishonesty, what it does for you goes far beyond frustration. It starts to make you question your reality. You might find yourself wondering, was any of this real? Have they just been telling me what I want to hear? Have I been building a relationship on something that wasn't actually true or isn't actually true? And that's incredibly destabilizing. Because in a relationship, we're not just looking for information, we're looking for something solid that we can stand on and build on. We're trying to build attachment on something that is real. So when honesty breaks down, it's not just about the lie itself. It's about losing a sense of safety and security. It's about not knowing what's true and not knowing if you can trust what you're being told moving forward. So wanting honesty, asking for honesty, needing honesty in a relationship, that's not too much. It's not controlling and it's not unreasonable. And this is where it gets complicated. Because even though that need for honesty is completely valid, the way honesty happens in these relationships isn't always as simple as asking for it. It's also not as simple as if you cared, you would just tell the truth. Sometimes what helps is shifting how we ask for honesty. Instead of asking the question and asking, did this happen? Did you relapse? And expecting them to tell you right then and there, it can shift into approaching them, asking them the question, did you relapse? And then saying, look, I want the truth. I care about the truth. And so you don't have to answer me right now. I understand it might take you some time to get there. Now, that might be a day, a couple of days, sometimes even a week. That doesn't mean they get to avoid the truth. It simply means that you're creating enough space for the truth to actually come forward instead of triggering the same shutdown pattern. And at the same time, the responsibility is still on the person who's been dishonest to come back and tell the truth. So that space isn't avoidance, it's a pause. There's another piece I see a lot, especially with addiction recovery. When someone finally tells the truth and their partner is hurt or sad or disappointed, they can get confused or discouraged. Like, I told the truth, but she's still upset. And this is really important to understand. Your partner's pain And I think this is where, again, it's complicated. Your partner's pain does not mean telling the truth was the wrong thing to do. It doesn't mean that lying would have been better. And it doesn't even mean that honesty isn't safe. It means the truth has an impact. And your partner is having a real emotional response to that impact. Honesty doesn't erase hurt. It allows the hurt to be seen and worked through. And sometimes there's this expectation, even if it's not said out loud, that the partner should be grateful or relieved or calm because the truth was told. But that's not how emotions work. Telling the truth is the beginning of repair, not the completion of it. Most partners are not asking for a perfect answer, and they do not want a people-pleasing answer. They're asking for something much deeper. They want you to take up space in the relationship, to be real, to be known, which requires showing up honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. Because that's the only way the relationship actually works. So part of the work becomes creating enough safety for the truth to be told, while also holding the expectation that the truth will be told. Honesty isn't just about getting the right answer. It's about building a relationship where both people can exist fully in what's real. And here's what I had to learn over a long period of time. Honesty isn't just about telling the truth to other people. It's about being honest with yourself. And that for me was the harder part. Letting myself really see what my experience was, letting myself name it, letting myself feel the impact of it. And that didn't happen quickly. It took me years, decades, to find the language for my story, to understand what it meant, and to trust what I felt. I think there was an important shift that had to happen for me to really value honesty. I think over time, lying to myself and not being honest with others became more painful to me than staying confused or minimizing or silencing myself, containing my truth, or telling a version of the story that didn't quite fit just to appease. All of that became more uncomfortable than being honest. At some point, not telling the truth cost me more than telling it. Now, sometimes people tell me I'm too honest, or I get this a lot. You're intimidating. Or they'll say, you always ask the questions that nobody else would. For me, growing up not seeing clearly, not trusting what I felt, and not being able to name what was right in front of me, and then living in confusion, that was far more disorienting than honesty has ever been. I don't want to be confused. I don't want to be guessing. And I don't want to be telling myself a story that doesn't match reality. I will also share, and I think this was really important for me. I was married to somebody who could handle my truth. He didn't minimize it. He didn't reply with useless platitudes like, I'm sure your parents loved you, or try to soften it in a way that made it easier to hear, but less true. He could sit with it. He could hear it without needing me to change it for him. And I think part of that was because he wasn't just hearing my story for the first time. He knew my family. He grew up 5 houses down the street from me. And he had his own experiences of my dad before I even met him. He's told me about a time when he and some friends were maybe around 10 years old, and they were throwing snowballs at cars that were driving by. And they hit my dad's car. My dad hit the brakes. He backed up. They saw whose car it was, and they scattered, they ran, and they hid. They knew he was scary in their own way. My husband had seen my mom lose it more than once. He had seen my dad punch my younger brother when he was a teenager. So when I started talking about my experience, he wasn't trying to convince me of anything different. He didn't need me to tell it differently for his comfort. He could hold it. And I think that mattered more than I realized at the time. I think that's part of why I married him. I think I wanted somebody who could also know my story. It made it possible for me to stay with what was true instead of softening it, minimizing it, or questioning myself. And he's the only in-law that married into my family who had his own experiences with both of my parents. I've also worked with couples where their spouse is seeing and feeling things about their parents that they're not ready to yet. And that can cause all sorts of conflict. And often it's confusing for the partner who's seeing it or feeling it, and for the member of the family who still can't. Sometimes we don't tell the truth because we don't know it yet. Other times we don't tell the truth not because we don't know it, but because we don't feel like it can be held. And this is important in relationships because honesty doesn't just depend on the person telling the truth. It also depends on whether truth can be received. Let me share one more personal story that happened just 2.5 years ago. And I'll have to start with some background information. When my mom asked my dad for a separation, I was in the process of planning my wedding. And when we got back from our honeymoon, the plan was that she would ask him to leave. My mom thought that she needed to ask for a separation first, so he wouldn't feel like it was final and react from that place. Before we left on our honeymoon, my brother and husband removed the guns from the house and moved them to our apartment. Out of an abundance of caution, better safe than sorry. I don't think we ever told my mom we were doing that. And asking my dad for a separation was actually anticlimactic. When she asked him for a separation, and then a year later, a divorce, my grandma, who was my dad's mom, cut us off. She didn't have any contact with us after that. When I had my first baby, I sent her an announcement and a picture. I never heard anything back from her. She didn't send a gift or any kind of acknowledgement. I sent her something every time I had a baby, and I got no response. My dad had an older half brother who was also married, and they had 3 kids. Their youngest was 4 years older than my older sister, so 6 years older than me. And we grew up seeing them at Grandma and Grandpa's house on holidays. I wouldn't say we were close, and the age thing made a difference, but we knew them and they knew us. When my grandma cut us off, my grandpa had already passed away. My aunt, my uncle, and my three cousins also had nothing more to do with us. My grandma didn't come to my siblings' weddings because my dad was avoiding paying child support. So he didn't come either. When my youngest sibling got married, we didn't know if my dad would come. Obviously, that sibling was old enough now that child support was no longer required. But we didn't know if he would come or if my grandma would come. They both came together. My oldest daughter at the time was 7. So that would make daughter number 2 5 years old. And daughter number 3 would have been 3 or 4. And then I had a baby. And my dad and my grandma walked up to me, my husband, our kids are standing there. And I said to my kids, I said, oh, this is my grandma. And then this is my dad. I don't even think my kids registered that this is my grandma. Their eyes were popping. They hadn't realized I had a dad. My husband's father passed away suddenly when my oldest was 6 months old. So they didn't really think about either of us having a dad. And they're at that age, 7 and 5, where they're starting to be aware that their parents were once kids and their grandparents are their parents' parents. That's just such a huge realization for kids to go through. And after that wedding, for weeks, my kids had questions. We'd be driving in the car, and one of them would say, Mom, remember that guy that's your dad? Yeah. Did you know him when you were little? I did. A couple of days go by, we're driving in the car. Mom, remember that guy that's your dad? Yeah. Does he know grandma? Yeah, he did know grandma. It just blew their mind. So jump ahead to 2022. My cousin's wife, they were married before we got cut off. My cousin's wife had reached out via social media messaging to the brother just under me, wanting to get together for a family barbecue and asking if he would host it. My brother agreed. He sent a text out to all 6 of us saying, hey, so and so reached out. They want me to host a barbecue and get together. My 3 youngest siblings were like, I know who these people are. I've heard their names, but I could pass them on the street and not even recognize them. My youngest brother said, I think I'm closer to my cousin's son than them. I don't even know these people. So the 3 younger ones didn't go. And my brother, who was hosting, called me and said, look, I know it's the weekend before your daughter's wedding, but I really want you to come. It's going to be awkward. I don't want to be the only one there. And I said, if we can at all make it, I'll be there. So my older sister, me, and then the brother who was hosting, we went. So the oldest 3 went. And that evening before the barbecue, one of my kids came into the kitchen and she was like, now, where are you and dad going? And I said, oh, we're going over to my brother's house for a barbecue with our cousins. And she said, oh, what cousins? And she was absolutely thinking of the cousins on my mom's side of the family, who she knows. And I said, oh, these are cousins on my dad's side of the family. And I told her their names. And she just stopped for a minute and she said, Mom, when are you going to stop just pulling out this information that completely shocks us? I didn't know you had cousins on your dad's side of the family. She said, I didn't know your dad had a sibling. And I said, Well, I mean, it never came up. I haven't seen them since I've had kids. And she said, "When was the last time you saw them?" And I said, "I don't, it's been well over 30 years since I've seen them." And she just was like, "What?" And so I gave her this backstory that I just gave you guys. And she was like, "I kind of want to go just to watch this, but I'm not going to go." And I was like, "Yeah, you don't have to go." So my older sister and her husband came. Me and my husband went. And my brother, who was hosting, was there, but his wife was out of town and he had teenagers at the time. They didn't come. They all had plans that night. So we went to the barbecue, which was strange enough already. So my three cousins were there with their spouses and their kids, and even their kids' were there. And it was strange that it had been over 30 years since we'd even seen them or heard anything from them. But I think what was even stranger for me is that they were talking as if none of that had ever happened. They were talking and sharing stories about my grandma as she got older and how she was such a great grandma. And my cousin's kids would talk about their memories with grandma. And they were sharing these stories as if we'd all been there together and we were just walking down memory lane. At one point, my older sister leaned over to me and said, "Don't say anything. Just go along with this." And I looked at her and said, "I don't think I can promise that." I said, "If they keep talking like we were present for all of this, I'll probably say something." And they kept talking like we knew all these stories. And I did say something. I didn't make a scene. I didn't confront anyone. I just said, "I don't know if you know this, but grandma cut us all off when our parents divorced." And they acted shocked. They said, "Oh, we had no idea." And so, again, that's confusing to me. I asked, "Well, what did you think happened to us?" They said they thought my grandma just had separate gatherings with us. At this point, I didn't push it any further, but I also knew that wasn't true. In my body, I felt they were lying. For a lot of those years, social media wasn't a thing. And it was after that barbecue that they sent us friend requests or follow requests. So in my mind, I'm just thinking, what would grandma say about us? Because she wouldn't know what's happening. Neither would my dad. But here's what was different for me in that moment. I didn't feel the need to expose it or prove it or make anyone admit it like I could make anybody admit it. But I also wasn't willing to go along with something that wasn't true for their comfort. That might seem like a small moment, but for me, it wasn't. Because there was a time in my life when I would have stayed quiet. I would have gone along with it to keep things comfortable, to keep the connection and not to disrupt anything. But enough had changed and shifted in me that I didn't need to create a scene and I didn't need to ignore what I knew to be true. I could hold both. And there was a time in my life, a long period of time in my life, that I couldn't have done that, where I would have stayed quiet. I would have gone along with things to keep them comfortable and to not disrupt anything. But something had shifted. Today, I can say what is true and let it be. And if I decide not to say anything, it's because I made a conscious choice not to. And I'm okay with that. When I work with clients, I tell them the goal isn't just be honest. The goal first has to be to learn how to tolerate the truth. Because honesty isn't just a value, it's a capacity, a nervous system capacity that gets built over time. And it's much more complex than we acknowledge. Sometimes it starts really small, saying something like, "This is hard, but I want to be honest." That's a different system from shutting down or just avoiding or automatically telling a lie. And if this is something you recognize in yourself, I want you to know this doesn't mean you're broken. It means you learned something very early that helped you survive. And now you need to learn something new. Honesty isn't just about telling the truth, it's about becoming someone who can handle it. And one of the things I've come to understand is this: as the truth reveals itself to you, it can be very painful, really painful. But it also settles you. It settles something in your body because you're no longer trying to hold together something that doesn't fit. And there's a steadiness that comes with that, even when it's hard. And that's part of what I mean when I say I came by my dishonesty honestly. I'm not excusing it, I'm understanding it. Because understanding it is what allows us to change. The goal isn't just to tell the truth, it's to be able to stay with it, to settle there, and to live in it. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.